Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And I've been going through the PowerPoint presentations. I have finished the textbook, the 18 or 19 chapters, 19 I believe, for Murachs HTML5 and CSS 3rd edition, which is one of the two textbooks that we're using for the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. So it's time to start on the second book, which is Murachs JavaScript and jQuery 3rd edition. There are 18 chapters in this book, and I'm going to start on it right now. Now you'll notice that Chapter 1 here is called Introduction to Web Development, and you can see what's in here. How web apps work, an introduction to HTML and CSS, tools for web development, how to deploy web pages, and 5 critical web development issues. Well, if I go to the JavaScript and look at the first one, lo and behold, it's basically the same chapter. All right, so I am going to go over it, but if it sounds familiar to you rather, that will be why. All right, so let's just get started. So as you can see here, we have what, 4 applied and 12 knowledge objectives. Run JavaScript applications that are on the internet, your computer or local server by loading the associated HTML documents into the browser. Use Chrome's developer tools to find the JavaScript statement that caused an error in a JavaScript application. Use a text editor or IDE, which is short for Integrated Development Environment, like AWD1000 Studio 3 to edit HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. If you're using an IDE like AWD1000 Studio 3 that lets you run applications from it, run the application from the IDE. Those are our 4 applied objectives. For our knowledge objectives, describe the components of a web application. Describe hypertext transfer protocol requests and responses. Distinguish between the way a web server processes static web pages and dynamic web pages. Describe the use of JavaScript in a web application. Describe the use of HTML and CSS. Distinguish between the HTML5 semantic elements and the HTML5 div and span elements. Describe the use of the following HTML attributes: ID, class, title, for, and name. Describe the coding for IDs and classes. Describe the components of a CSS style rule. Describe the components of a URL. Describe the issue of cross-browser compatibility as it relates to the development of web pages and JavaScript applications. And finally, our 12th and final knowledge objective, describe the ECMAScript. ECMA is an acronym that stands for European Computer Manufacturer Association, and the use of ES 2015 and ES 2016 with older browsers. So here are the components of a web application, how this has changed over the last few years. It used to just say computer, computer, and computer, but now, considering the fact that more than half the people who access the internet are accessing it not using a laptop or a desktop, but rather using a phone or a tablet, that's what it looks like right now. JavaScript is something, in this class, we will work entirely with JavaScript on the browser side, so on these 3, and we will send a file to a web server. So some terms: client. You talk about a thing like client server will be the client. We will use a web browser. We will type an address in or click on a link in our web browser, which will create or cause an hypertext transfer protocol HTTP request to go to a web server. The web server either will be able to answer that request itself or may have to call upon one or more other servers to get that information, send it back to the web server that will format it into HTML to send it back to the client. A network are computers that are either physically linked together like a local area network or wired together through a router and other mechanisms like a wide area network. All right, an intranet is kind of a private internet. For instance, here at Rankin Technical College, we have an intranet so that people across all three of our campuses can communicate with one another. The internet, on the other hand, basically is global. It's the World Wide Web. All right, really the World Wide Web is part of the internet. All right, an ISP, an internet service provider, basically houses one or normally more web servers on it and allows you to connect to them. Now this is a static web page. A static web page ends with .html or .htm. A static web page looks the same every time you see it unless the user takes it down, makes a change to it, and puts it back up on the internet. For a static web page, typically it's a very simple type of processing that takes place. Again, HTTP is an acronym that stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The web browser makes an HTTP request. The web server answers that HTTP request, sends back an HTTP response. These are static web pages, all right? And the response that gets sent back that the computer can see on his or her web page is known as rendering the web page. On the other hand, when you work with a dynamic web page, it does not typically end with .html. Rather, it ends with .php or .aspx or .jsp. But the idea behind a dynamic web page is that quite often several web servers are involved. So you'll notice in this case we still have our HTTP request. We still get back our HTTP response with HTML. But the web server typically doesn't do all the work by itself. Rather, it calls upon other servers to get the work done. This act of going from web browser to web server to application server to database server, back to application server, back to web server, back to web browser is known as a round trip. Now, some of the stuff that you're going to be able to do here, just so you know, as an example with an image rollover. Let's look at this one. It's a little more colorful. You can see that we've got kind of a mustard and blue because we've highlighted that one. If we click here, this will be like blue and blue, and if we click here, it'll be maroon and blue. If we've got here, the only color that's available in is gray. Here we've chosen blue. If we click here, this color, this image will become burgundy, and if we click here, it looks like it'll become a dark gray. So with an image swap and an image rollover, the idea is interactivity, that I can make changes here and they'll be reflected immediately upon the web page. So how does JavaScript fit into this? JavaScript is basically the key ingredient to allowing this interactivity to take place. JavaScript is a scripting language. It's got the features of a programming language, but it is a scripting language. It's something that augments or adds to a web browser so that you're able to provide interactivity on a website. We'll get into all this stuff that you see here as we go on. Some of the many uses of JavaScript and jQuery include, number one, data validation, making sure the data is valid on the client side or for the user before it gets sent over to a server. Image swaps and rollovers, which we just looked at, and slideshows. You can quite often create a slideshow with just a couple lines of code and have it look pretty impressive on an actual website. As far as the versions and release dates of the ECMA specification, you can take a look at those. And you'll also notice here that it's got a URL that shows a browser compatibility table. I have not even looked at this URL, but we can right now. These are the different features of JavaScript, and what you want is green. Green means good. Green typically means it's supported by the browser. Red typically means it's not supported by the browser. So I can make this even smaller so you can see virtually all of it here. Some of the stuff that's been added in recent ECMA specifications. The first one there says allows you to run in strict mode. JavaScript is an unbelievably forgiving language. By using strict mode, it becomes a little less forgiving and it makes you a better programmer. We'll talk about that as we go on. Add some new methods to make it easier to work with arrays. Again, we will cover that in a later lecture. Add a safer way to create objects and more control over object properties. And finally, add a built-in way to work with what's called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. And again, all this stuff will be discussed in later lectures. Other additions, adding promises for callback functions, adding syntactic improvements that make code easier to read and understand, adding block scope, and easier ways to work with classes, adding several built-in methods for working with strings, numbers, objects, and arrays, adding a simpler syntax for computation with powers, and adding more array elements. All right, these are all things that we will discuss, some in detail, some in passing, in later lectures. All right, now, when you work to create a website, typically a website has got three components. The HTML, or the hypertext markup language, which allows us to create our content. The CSS, or cascading style sheets, which allow us to beautify, so to speak, our content. And the JavaScript, which adds the interactivity. Here is a simple HTML file. It's a static file, and there's been no CSS applied to it. Just kind of there. It kind of looks ugly. All right? Well, once we go and link in a style sheet, we turn this into this. Much more pleasing to the eye. It's got a lot more capability. And what you'll also find is not only will we add a CSS file to do this, but we'll add a JavaScript file, meaning that all of these fields here are required, and if we don't put one of them in and we click this button where we've got the red asterisk here, it will change to an error message. Plus, the email address here and here have to be the same. And if they're not, when we click, if we have a valid email address, that'll go away, but it'll say here, this message will say, these two do not match. It'll also make sure that our email address is well formed. All right, so to do this, we have to start with HTML. We have to add CSS to it. All right, and then sooner or later, to get this, as I already mentioned, we have to add JavaScript. Now, you might find this very daunting at the beginning, but it really and truly is not terrible. One nice thing about JavaScript is if you write it in the way that it should be written, it's a fairly intuitive language. You can pretty much understand, hopefully at least, what it is you're trying to do. All right. Now, for years we had HTML, then HTML2, then HTML3, then HTML4, then HTML 4.01, then HTML 4.1, then HTML kind of dwindled and went away for a while. And a new language was created that was called XHTML. All right, which was Extensible Hypertext Markup Language, which was kind of a cross between HTML, the hypertext markup language, and XML, the Extensible Markup Language. But although that language is still used, and although XML is still used, probably about 10 or 15 years ago, people got together and said, you know what, let's bring back HTML and make it do what we want it to do. One of those things they wanted it to do was to be more semantic. So in other words, you could see the tags and figure out what their meaning is. So there are new things in HTML5 like header tags, main tags, section tags, article tags, aside tags, nav tags, figure tags, and footer tags. All right, these are new with Hypertext Markup Language 5. So notice here, when we did this in the past, we ended up having a lot of, there's a main, but we ended up having a lot of divs and spans. Now these divs and spans have been replaced with semantic tags. This is our header area. This is our main area. This is our footer area, etc. It doesn't look any different on the screen than the way it used to look, but it's more semantically set up for the browser to be able to handle it. Div and span have not gone away. All right. div and span are still used as containers, and they allow you to work and do formatting. Their scope has changed a little bit in HTML5, but that said, one of the other things you learn in this class is a package called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap does make great use of divs and, to a more limited extent, spans. All right. So here's where we're using a bunch of divs. Here's where we're using a bunch of spans. Don't worry right now about the difference between them because it's in a later chapter. We will discuss this in a lot of depth and breadth of coverage. All right. Now, when you create things in your HTML, you typically want to give them things like IDs, classes, names, a for, and a title. So here's a class. What's going to happen is when I go and create my CSS, my cascading style sheets, I'll be able to code my cascading style sheet for a class of first H2. When I create my cascading style sheet, I'll be able to code for an ID of email form. All right. This right here, this label for equals means that when I do this, if I click on here, if I just click on the label, my mouse will go into here, into the field where I can input something. That's what that means. All right. The ID is something, again, that I can use with CSS. And the title here will allow me to take my mouse, put it over here, and get a tooltip. Again, this is all things you're going to see as we go on. We will be building cascading style sheets and then linking them to our HTML files. You can also put them right into your HTML file, which is considered a poor programming practice. All right. We can also include more than one style sheet. So here we have a regular style sheet, and maybe we'd have another one. I guess there's one for our main document, one for our speaker page. They go in order, so this one will be applied before this one. Then this one is applied after this one, etc. All right. So here's using a class. Here's using an ID. Notice here we say class is blue, and that gives us the blue text. Here we say ID is copyright. Well, the copyright is saying we want the font size to be 90%. So it's a little smaller, we want it pushed over to the right. These are all things that we will discuss in the book. We will create CSS files like this. In fact, by the time you see this presentation, you probably will have already created CSS files. Some of the terms for CSS files, these right here, everything between body and the curly brace and that ending curly brace, that's a style rule. That says that the entire body of our document will have a font family of Arial if possible. If not Arial, try Helvetica. If you can't find Helvetica, use the sans serif, which is a default font. The background color of our fonts will be white. The zero auto will mean center it on the page. It will be 670 pixels wide. It will have a 3-pixel solid blue border around it with some padding. Basically, I believe this is 0 padding top and bottom, 2 M's to the right and 1 M to the left. Our H1 tags will be blue, the font color. Our labels will automatically float to the left. They'll have a width of 11 M's, and the code will be right aligned. Our input tags will have a left margin of 1 M and a bottom margin of 1/2 M. Our spans will be red in color. Now, I don't expect you to remember all those. All right, but again, by the time we go through this, we should have, repeat, should have already written CSS files. All right, the property declaration is basically we're saying that property is going to be applied here. All right, and this is the stuff that we want applied. You'll see this as we go on. There's a lot of different ways to run an HTML page from your server or browser. All right, one way, and I don't know if I've got any on my home page or not, but I'm going to try to check here. Let's see See, I got a lot of stuff open, unfortunately. All right. So if I come through here and there's an index.html page, there's a bunch of them here. If I just double click on this one, boom, it opens it up. Now it's a little hard to see, so I'll make it bigger. But I can also take the same page and open it up by right mouse clicking on it and choosing open with and telling it the browser I want to use. So Firefox. And in just a second, it will open up the same page. All right. I can open it up in any browser that I have loaded onto my system. Here are the components of a URL. So if I went out to this right here, chances are pretty good I wouldn't have to even put in the index.html. But the http:// means I'm using that same hypertext transfer protocol that we talked about earlier. The www.modulemedia.com is the domain name. Our work is a folder underneath the domain name, and index.html is a file under that folder. Typically, if you omit the http:// and just start with www, it's going to default to http:. If you leave the file name, it's going to look for a file by default called index.html. If it can't find it, it'll look for one called index.htm. If it can't find that, it'll look for a file called default.html. If it can't find that, it'll look for a file called default.htm. And if it can't find that, it may or may not give you an error. All right. Now it says Chrome with an open console panel. You'll notice just a second ago I showed you what it looked like to have this open. On the top of your screen, on the top of your keyboard, you've got 12 keys that go from F1 to F12. If I hit the F12 key, I bring up right there my Chrome Developer Tools. So I can go and check in here and I can see just exactly what I have in here. All right, so what you'll notice is I've got a bunch of other code here that I've commented out. All right, there's not very much in here right now that I can actually see. I can come over to my console here and I can type in 44 plus 66, hit enter, notice it gives me 110. I can do math. I can say alert, Jeff says hello. Oh, you got to say alert, not a Kurt. Got to do it again. A-L-E-R-T. Jeff says hello. And there you get it. All right. We'll have a whole chapter where we talk about that, so don't worry about it for right now. You hit the F12 key to open up those developer tools that I just showed you. You hit F12 again to close it. Nothing hard about that. We will be working on this. I showed you the console. You can also use the console for debugging or finding errors in your code. All right. Okay. Now, these are the most used browsers today. All right. I will be using Chrome almost exclusively for this class, but there are other browsers that you can use as well. Okay. For instance, Safari is the default browser for a Mac, any Apple machine. IE is on any Windows machine, you get it by default. Edge is pretty much the new IE, etc. All right. We will talk when we get into this about using what's called an HTML5 shiv file. It's also sometimes called shim. So it's either SHIV as in Victor or SHIM as in Mary. But it allows the system to work even if you use the new HTML5 elements on older browsers. we'll talk about a normalized CSS style sheet so that we're starting and we're basically taking any default browser stuff that's set up and getting rid of it. All right, we'll look at CDNs a little bit later, which is a content delivery network. Some of the terms that we will discuss as we go on in here. First one there, cross-browser compatibility. In an ideal world, our website will look the same on all browsers. If it would look exactly the same on Firefox and IE and Chrome and Edge, etc., I would have achieved cross-browser compatibility. We'll look at all of the stuff that's in here again as we go on. All right, then they talk about Aptana, and Aptana is the IDE, or the Integrated Development Environment, the free IDE that the author recommends that you use. By the time you see these videos, I will have given you another video that's going to be on the different editors and the different IDEs, or integrated development environments, that are available to you, and let you make your choice as far as which one you want to use. All right, so this is all stuff with Aptana. I'm not going to go over that right now. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using the Aptana IDE, but I think that if you see other ones and you make your choice, you'll be making a more well-informed choice. That is it for the first chapter. So I'm going to stop here, and in just a moment, I'm going to come back with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is on getting started with JavaScript. So I'll be back with that shortly.